Hello everyone, I am Sheila May Cabrera, a first-year student taking Bachelor of Science in Secondary Education, major in English. And I am here together with my group mates to tackle about the first school of thought in second language acquisition, and that is structural linguistics and behavioral psychology. Structural linguistics, or structuralism, was developed by a Swiss linguist, Ferdinand de Saussure, between 1913 and 1915. Before Saussure, language was studied diachronically, wherein structuralists study and focus in the history and cause of change in individual words over time. And it was assumed that words somehow imitated the objects for which they stood.
Diachronic study is the kind in which we study the historical development of language through different periods of time. Example, 12th century English and 21st century English were related things exist separated by time.
But then, Saussure realized that we need to understand language, not as a collection of words with histories, but as a structural system of relationship among words as they are used at a given point in time.
Call that synchronic study, wherein synchronic study how language interact and compare to each other at a given point in time. Example, modern American English and British English have synchronic relation because they exist at the same time. Structuralism doesn't look for the causes or origins of language, but looks for the rules that underlie language and govern how it functions. It looks for the structure. Structuralism is about finding the fundamental basic units or elements that make up any system and discovering the rules that govern how these units can be combined. And it is closely related to semiology, the study of sign, symbols, communication, and how meaning is constructed and understood. In order to differentiate between the structure that governs language and the millions of individual utterances, Saussure called the structure of language lang, and he called the individual utterances that occur when we speak or the actual oral and written way of communication parole. The components of a structure are not merely a collection of independent items. They form a working unit because they exist in relation to one another. They interact, and we are able to perceive those components because we perceive their differences. Differences simply means that our ability to identify an entity between all other entities. For example, if we believe that all objects were the same color, we wouldn't need the word red, blue, green, etc. Red is only red because we perceive it to be different from blue or green. Other than that, we also perceive them in terms of opposites. That enters binary oppositions, which is two ideas directly opposed of which we understand because of its opposition to the other. For example, we understand up as the opposite of down and female as the opposite of male.
Saussure argued that words do not simply refer to objects in the world for which they stand. Instead, a word is a linguistic sign consisting, like the two sides of a coin, of two inseparable parts. He presented this as a sign theory,
wherein there is a triangle relationship between sign, signifier, and signified. Sign is the combination of signifier and signified, wherein signifier is the first side consists of mental image. On the other hand, signified is the concept of that thing. Thus, a word is not merely a sound image, and not merely a concept, because a sound image becomes a word only when it is linked with a concept. The idea that signifiers do not refer to things in the world but to concepts in our minds. Furthermore, the relationship between signifier and signified Saussure observed is arbitrary. There is no necessary connection between a given sound and the concept to which it refers. There is no reason why the concept of a book is represented by the sound image livre as the sound image book. The relationship between signifier and signified is merely a matter of social convention. It's whatever the communities using it says it is. To understand sign, signifier, and signified, one should know the meaning of denotation and connotation. Denotation is the literal meaning of the sign, while connotation is the suggested or the emotional meaning of the sign. For example, heart is the denotation, and love and affection is the connotation. Strengths of structuralism. This theory does focus on the author's intent and does focus on an objective interpretation without clouding the text with a subjective or emotional interpretation. According to this, an author's intentions should be constrained in which a text is properly interpreted and not influenced by personal feelings or opinions in considering and representing facts about the text or language. Weaknesses of structuralism. Difficult to know who controls the meaning of a text. Difficult to know in a way that the meaning of a word or text depends upon how we interpret every text. Reader looks only at linguistic structure and is not permitted to have an emotional attachment to the text. Readers will only study and focus about how a text was formed without giving opinions and reactions toward the language. Not open to different interpretation. Not open in a way that the text's specific meaning is the only accepted and no other meaning or interpretation should be attached to it.
Given that language is the most fundamental of these structures and the one through which our beliefs are passed from one generation to the next, it makes sense that it is through language that we learn to conceive and perceive the world the way we do. This is why learning a new language carries with it the potential to learn and to see the world in new ways.
Structuralism was the first school of thought in psychology, emerged in around century and was related to as introspective psychology. Introspective psychology was defined as the study of elements of consciousness where it involves breaking down and analyzing the mind into smaller possible parts. When we say consciousness, it talks about the self-awareness of every individual, wherein your mindset can be possibly included because the way you learn from experiences or the way you enhance your knowledge, there is always an understanding wherein it always exists when you relate some ideas onto your experiences. Introspective psychology talks about the analyzing such part of the way you think, the way you make connections about your ideas or experiences, and also it can be proven and tested for that elements wherein you can think if they are connected to each other or they can arrange at some point, and wherein introspective psychology can be needed to point out the connections of such ideas on your mindset, and also it enhances your thinking skills. Two prominent names in the school of thought are Wilhelm Maximilian Wundt, the founder. He was a German physiologist, philosopher, and professor known today as one of the founders of modern psychology. Edward B. Titchener, the developer, described his systems as structuralism or the analysis of the basic elements that constitute the mind. Wilhelm Wundt is the professor of Edward B. Titchener. Goals and aims. Structuralism, a theory of consciousness which seeks to analyze thoughts and sensations of a mind that bring about the more complex experience that we go through our day-to-day life. Method used to study these conscious experiences was introspection. As I've said earlier, consciousness can be related on individuals' experiences, wherein you can learn from it or you can develop yourselves based from your experience or learnings through others. Introspection is the examination or observation of one's mental or emotional processes. Wundt's aim was to record thoughts and sensations and to analyze them into their constituent elements in much the same way as a chemist analyzes chemical compounds in order to get an underlying structure. The school of psychology founded by Wundt is known as voluntarism, the process of organizing the mind. Wundt wanted to study the structure of the human mind using this introspection because he believes in reductionism. He also believes that consciousness can be broken or reduced to its basic elements without sacrificing properties of the whole. Wundt argued that conscious mental states could be scientifically studied using this introspection. This introspection is not also a casual affair for him, but a highly practiced form of examination. This Wundt's method of introspection did not remain a fundamental tool of psychological experimentation, and his great contribution was to show the psychology could be a valid experimental. At the same time, Wundt himself believed that experimental approach was limited in scope and that other methods would be necessary if all aspects of human psychology were to be investigated. Wundt's theory was developed and promoted by his one-time student Edward Titchener, who described his system as structuralism, or the analysis of the basic elements that constitute the mind. Titchener concluded that there were three kinds of mental components that could be considered to constitute conscious experience: sensations, components of sight, sound, and taste; images, components of thoughts; affection, components of emotion. These components could be black-coated into their particular properties, which he decided were quality, intensity, duration, clearness, and even extensity. Quality distinguishes each element from the others, while intensity talks about on how loud, how bright does the sensation is. In addition, duration talks about the course of the sensation, or on how long does the time or how does it long last. Clearness talks about the attention of the consciousness, wherein it should be directed to make it clearer.
Behavioral psychology. Behaviorism is a systematic approach to understanding the behavior of humans and other animals. It assumes that human behavior is either a reflex evoked by the pairing of certain antecedent stimuli in the environment or consequences of the individual's history, including especially reinforcement and punishment contingencies, together with the individual's current motivational state and controlling stimulus. In the simplest form, it was the theory that human and animal psychology can be objectively studied through observable action. Behaviorism influential figures include the psychologists John B. Watson and Bruce Frederick Skinner, who are associated with classical conditioning and operant conditioning. The History of Behaviorism, Pavlov, 1897, published the results of an experiment on conditioning after originally studying digestions in dogs. Watson, 1913, launched the Behavior School of Psychology, publishing an article, Psychology as the Behaviorist Views It. Thorndike, 1905, formalized the law of effect. Watson and Rayner, 1920, conditioned an orphan and called Albert B., aka Little Albert, to fear a white rat. Skinner, 1936, wrote The Behavior of Organisms and launched the concept of operant conditioning and shaping. We have three main types of behaviorism. The first type of behaviorism is methodological behaviorism. Methodological behaviorism is a normative theory about the scientific conduct of psychology. It claims that psychology should concern itself with behavior of organisms, human and non-human animals. Psychology should not concern itself with mental states or events or with constructing internal information processing accounts of behavior. According to methodological behaviorism, reference to mental states such as an animal's belief or desires and should understand about the source of behavior. Mental states are private entities which, given the necessary publicity of science, do not form proper objects of empirical study. Methodological behaviorism is a dominant theme in the writing of John Watson, 1878-1958. The second type of behaviorism is psychological behaviorism. The task of psychological behaviorism is to specify types of association, understand how environmental events control behavior, discover and elucidate causal regularities or laws or functional relations which govern the formation of associations, and predict how behavior will change as the environmental changes. The word conditioning is commonly used to specify the process involved in acquiring new associations. Animals in so-called operant conditioning experiments are not learning to, for example, press levers. Instead, they are learning about the relationship between events in their environment. For example, that a particular behavior, pressing the lever in the presence of the light, causes food to appear. The last type of behaviorism is analytical behaviorism. Analytical or logical behaviorism is a theory within philosophy about the meaning or semantics of mental terms or concepts. It says that the very idea of a mental state or condition is the idea of a behavioral disposition or family of behavioral tendencies evident in how a person behaves in one situation rather than another. When we attribute a belief to someone, we are not saying that he or she is in a particular internal state or condition. Instead, we are characterizing the person in terms of what he or she might do in a particular situations or environmental interactions.
There are two types of learning using behavioristic approach. Classical conditioning, also known as the Pavlovian or respondent's conditioning. It is the procedure of learning to associate an unconditioned stimulus that already brings about an involuntary response or unconditioned response with a new neutral stimulus so that its new stimulus can also bring about the same response. In classical conditioning, we have before, during, and after. So before conditioning, an unconditioned stimulus or what we call the food produces an unconditional response or the salivation, and the neutral stimulus called bell does not have an effect. In addition, during conditioning, the unconditioned stimulus or what we call the food is presented repeatedly just after the presentation of the neutral stimulus or what we call the bell. Moreover, after conditioning, the neutral stimulus alone produces a conditioned response or the salivation, thus becoming a conditioned stimulus. Yet, various behavior therapies for managing fear and anxiety, such as desensitization and flooding, have also developed from Pavlov's work. Operant conditioning, also known as instrumental conditioning, is the procedure of learning to increase or decrease a voluntarily behavior using reinforcement or punishment. Operant conditioning is a method of learning that employs rewards and punishments for behavior. Through operant conditioning, an association is made between behavior and consequence, whether negative or positive. But operant conditioning is not just something that takes place in experimental settings while training lab animals. It also plays a powerful role in everyday learning. Reinforcement and punishment take place in natural settings all the time, as well as in more structured settings such as classroom or therapy sessions.
Classical and operant conditioning are both similar because they involve making association between behavior and events in an organism's environment and are governed by several general laws of association. Classical conditioning associates involuntary behavior with a stimulus, while operant conditioning associates voluntary action with a consequence. For example, in classical conditioning, imagine a dog that salivates when it sees food. The animal does this automatically. He does not need to be trained to perform the behavior. It simply occurs naturally, and that is involuntary action. While in operant conditioning, imagine that a trainer is trying to teach a dog to fetch a ball. When the dog successfully chases and picks up the ball, the dog receives a food or praise as a reward, and that is an example of voluntary action. Classical conditioning is passive in the sense that the learner cannot choose to engage or not engage in a new behavior, because the association is made through naturally occurring event. On the other hand, the operant conditioning involves the learner actively choosing to receive the reinforcement or punishment by performing or not performing the target behavior. In classical conditioning, a person or animal learns to associate a neutral or conditioned stimulus with the unconditioned stimulus that naturally produces a behavior, or the unconditioned response. For example, a father comes home and slams the door whenever he has a bad day at work. Then it's usually followed by him yelling at his children for random reasons. So the kids have learned to associate door slamming with being yelled at. Now the children have been conditioned to tremble every time they hear the sound of door slamming. Operant conditioning focuses on using reinforcement or punishment to increase or decrease a behavior. Through this process, an association is formed between the behavior and the consequences of the behavior. For example, whenever a child goes to bed on time, his parents reads him a bedtime story. The reading of a story is a positive reinforcement used to increase target behavior, and that is going to bed on time. One of the greatest strengths of behavioral psychology is the ability to clearly observe and measure behavior. Because behaviorism is based on observable behaviors, so it is sometimes easier to quantify and collect data when conducting research. Behaviorism played a key role in making psychology more scientific. For example, most researchers now accept that laboratory experiments with measurable variables are the best of research, wherein classical conditioning is measured by speed or amount of response, while in operant conditioning, strength is measured by rate of production of behavior. Behavior modification is a treatment approach that replaces undesirable behaviors with more desirable ones, using a system of positive or negative consequences. An individual learns the correct set of responses for any given stimulus. For behaviorism provides simple, easily testable predictions about behavior. For example, the effect of reinforcement on behavior can be easily quantified. Useful for application in therapy, education, parenting, and childcare. Treatments based on classical or operant conditioning have been effective in treating some disorders. For example, behavioral therapy called systematic desensitization, which aims to remove the response of a phobia, and using behaviorism can be a helpful way to observe the behavior and attitude of an individual, especially by parents to their child, teachers to their students.
Behaviorism weaknesses. It does not consider for biological influences, does not consider moods, thoughts, and feelings. It does not explain all learning. It does not consider moods, thoughts, and feelings because it is one-dimensional approach to understand human behaviors, and that behavioral theories do not account for free will and internal influences. It tends also to be superficial or shallow in explaining behavior and learning. It only considers what is observable and what is measurable, while in fact there are various unseen aspects of an individual that are very vital in his or her personalities and learning capabilities. It does not explain all learning because it is not accountable for other types of learning, especially on learning that occurs without the use of reinforcement or punishment. As can be inferred from the theory that I've presented earlier, much of the human behavior and learning abilities were attributed to the effects of external factors that serves as reinforcers and also punishers. Peoples and animals used to adapt behaviors, new behaviors when new information is exists or attributed.